Hello and welcome to the interview. It is received wisdom in the West that President Recep Erdogan has pulled Turkey away from democracy in Europe and fashioned an illiberal state instead. And there's a common perception that Erdogan is an anomaly, a wily politician who somehow managed to subvert Turkey's journey towards Europe. And yet, if you take a closer look at Turkish history, there was nothing inevitable about the outcome of that journey. My guest today argues that Erdogan is merely the latest in a series of authoritarian figures who have taken advantage of structural weaknesses in the Turkish state. He is Eldem, a historian at Bosphorus University in Istanbul and at the Collège de France in Paris. Welcome to the program.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So this idea that Erdogan represents continuity and not a break with the past, do explain that for us.
Well, there are some breaks, obviously, but what I insist on as a historian is the continuities, because I think that is important if you want to really understand the dynamics of Turkish politics. And the continuity is in this weird relationship between a very weak or empty state, which looks very strong and has the means of being mean and strong, and strong political figures who can conquer it, basically, and use it to their advantage. And that is something that I link back to the Hamidian tradition, Abdul Hamid, at the end of the 19th century, from 1876-1909, whom I consider to be the founding father, quote unquote, of the Turkish state in its darkest sides.
Yeah, we'll get back to that Sultan later, but just I think you really hit the nail on the head when you say it looks strong, but it's actually weak. I mean, this is a misperception in the Western narrative that the Turkish state is strong because people think of the army and the role of the army, but just why is it weak, really?
Well, that's one form of strength, obviously, but what I call a strong state is a state that can stand on its own and can oppose any attack that is meant to destabilize it or dismantle it, and therefore institutions.
Institutions. So unlike the US, where you have a president who would like to do things but can't.
Exactly. I think that's a good comparison. I mean, in the US, despite everything that Trump does, there are still pockets of resistance in the administration and in the political system that make it impossible for him to get away with everything. Yeah. That's the point. Whereas the Turkish institutions, I mean, look at the Constitutional Court and whatever, they have to a large extent bowed to the authority of Erdogan, and that is something that I can trace back to the 1870s or 1880s with Abdul Hamid, and then the Young Turks, the Unionists, and then the Kemalists.
Yeah, but it seems incredible that for decades the institutions would have remained weak enough for this takeover to happen as quickly as it did after the failed coup of July 2016.
Again, I mean, there's a lot of cosmetic arrangement to the Turkish state. I mean, the Turkish state in its democratic period from, say, the 60s to the 80s is a state that was held under the control of the army and of the judicial that defended what you may call the red lines of Kemalism. And therefore, it was a limited democracy. So it looked like a strong state, but in fact, it was a state that was under control, and therefore that did not have the strength to stand alone against all these challenges. And there's, of course, the fact that what really constitutes a challenge to such a state is the rise of a political figure or a political party strong enough to maintain its power long enough to conquer the state. So think of the state as some kind of a void thing. And the problem is that the distinction that you would expect to exist between state and government can be blurred at any instant. And therefore, the government becomes the state. And that's the end of the state, if you want.
It sounds like you're being a bit historically deterministic. I mean, it's almost as if Turkey is condemned to repeat this history. Is that fair?
No, it's not the only option. I mean, I'm just saying that this is some kind of a dominant trend that I can trace in certain periods. It's not the only one. I mean, what Abdul Hamid dismantled in the 1880s is the rule of law. That is a state that, in a very conservative way, the elites of the Tanzimat tried to build on a European model, but that was based on some kind of a bureaucratic elite, a rational bureaucratic elite, that was based on the rule of law. So that is an option. And therefore, my hope is to see that people will realize that the only option is not that of a strong leader. That's in the ads for the political campaign now. Not a strong leader, but strong institutions.
Right, a return to a kind of bureaucratic
And there
state.
is that tradition too. It's just that tradition requires more of an effort of pluralism and participation by several actors coming together and agreeing to some kind of a neutrality of the state, or maintaining a state that will, if necessary, censor their behavior when it goes astray.
Yeah. I want to ask you about this, harking back to Sultan Abdulhamid II, and we actually have a picture of Recep Tayyip Erdogan with a picture of the Sultan over his head, which is going to bring you that in a second. How do you explain this? I mean, what is this instrumentalization exactly?
Well,
how is it going
Turkish
on?
politics have always been very, very interested in manipulating, abusing history to create a certain ideological construct. Kemalism did it, everybody did it, so he's doing it too. He started with a very general Ottomanist thing, but now he's narrowed it down to Abdulhamid. And the reason is, I think, that Abdulhamid is a contemporary of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, and therefore he's the ideal anti-Kemal, if you want, and therefore gives you a very strong anchoring in an alternative scenario, an alternative script for recent Ottoman and Turkish history. So it's not a very scientifically or historiographically sound construct. It's really a reinvention according to the needs of today.
We have that picture. I mean, do you think this actually works with Turkish voters, this kind of image?
It may, to a certain extent, because, I mean, what Abdulhamid has is the victimization, which is very popular in Turkish politics. The fact that he is seen as the last sultan who tried to resist the imperialism of the West and whatever. And he is a sultan who's associated with some kind of a pan-Islamist policy. So therefore, he has all sorts of positive attributes that are very, very consistent with Turkish conservatism.
And of course, defense against the other, the Kurds, the Armenians, all that sort of thing.
But you have that in Mustafa Kemal too, in Atatürk too. The difference is about secularism or not. Right. And therefore, what Abdulhamid offers to the Turkish public is this vision of the coming together of Turkish glory and Islamic identity in some kind of an Ottoman reinvention of history.
Eldem, I'd like to ask you, what is it like to be a historian given the scale of this purge? I mean, if you look at, for example, the monitoring site, Turkey purged more than 5,800 academic jobs have been lost in this crackdown since July 2016. Is the work of a genuine historian being compromised?
Not exactly, and I'm going to tell you why. It's because nobody reads us. That's the advantage of the academe. I mean, unless you go public, unless you go on TV and whatever and talk, and nobody wants to hear what we, good historians, have to say. So it's not really a problem. And most of the academics who have been purged have not been on the basis of what they academically produce, but on the basis of their political positions, which is not defendable. But I'm just saying it's different. And therefore, it's, ignorance, or the fact that you're ignored by all gives you some kind of a latitude. It's the ivory tower syndrome working to your advantage.
So in other words, there's the process of opening up Turkish history that started in the 90s when the first conferences were held about the fate of the Armenians, for example.
That was in 2005, yes.
Right. That work is still, that hasn't been compromised, that sort of opening, because as you say, it's not so visible. It's going on sort of in conference rooms and in journals and so on.
No, because it ends up being very marginal. I mean, given the big picture, even the Armenian genocide is something that comes up every 24th of April when we worry about what the American president is going to call the Mexican, whatever. So it's really a very marginal issue. The real difference is between historians who feed this very nationalist reinvention of history and therefore do history that is worth not much, and the professional historians who keep to their business and end up being marginalized, but that saves them to a certain extent.
So as a professional historian, what are the limits today? I mean, say you wanted to say well, like you're saying in this interview, for example, that Erdogan is basically, in a way, distorting the historical record. Is that a political act that you're making in the media
I've
then?
said it. I've said it not on the media. I've published it.
Yeah.
And I would say it if I were invited.
And you're
to.
not, and that doesn't have a backlash. I mean, that's.
I don't know. I haven't tested the media side of it, but not necessarily. That's the problem of this kind of authoritarianism is that it's unpredictable, which makes it very. So you never know how far, how lenient the system is going to be or not.
Well, we'll have to watch that space. Thank you so much for being my guest, and thank you for being on France 24. Eldem, professor at Bosphorus University in Istanbul and also at the Collège de France here in Paris. And of course, we'll be following that Turkish election live for you here on France 24. Stay tuned.